Hello and welcome to Romance Studies 202, Literature and Culture from Modernism to the Present. And today I'm very particularly delighted, actually, that we have with us Fabricio Tocco. Fabricio Tocco, Professor Tocco, teaches in the School of Literature, Language and Linguistics at Australian National University in Canberra. He's the author of several books, including one on Latin American detective fiction, Latin American Detectives Against Power, and most recently, a book about a history of the Latin American political thriller called Precarious Secrets. And I'm particularly happy to have Fabricio because he also finished his PhD, did his PhD here at UBC. So we're here to discuss this book, Ricardo Piglia, the Argentine Ricardo Piglia's book, translated as Money to Burn, Plata Quemada in the Spanish. Thank you so much, Fabricio, for doing this. And how would you suggest approaching this book?
Thank you so much, John. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I think that, of course, the whole book is interesting, but I would start by the end. I think that the ending of the novel is what's most striking. Of course, the novel talks about a real event, a real fact, but it's very interesting how Piglia reconstructs all this history through literature, right? Through imagination, through myths. I think that's a very good place to start.
So we'll just as a reminder that this is a book which is about a heist, a bank robbery in the 1960s in Argentina, or just outside of Buenos Aires in Argentina, and then what develops in Montevideo across the River Plate in Uruguay, where the thieves besieged in a house. And so Piglia tells this story, but as you say, at the end, there's an afterword in which Piglia says a little bit. He or his narrator talks a little bit about the process by which he has come 30 years later to put this book together. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about this relationship between a history that he's retelling on the one hand, and literature or myth.
Mhm. Yeah, so something quite interesting about this, in his diaries, Los Diarios de Emilio Renzi, that he wrote throughout his life, but published only the latest years of his life, he constantly mentions this book. He's been working on this project for 30 years. He only seriously ended up writing it in the 90s and published it in the 90s. But he started working on it ever since the historical event happened. And I think it established a very interesting relationship, not only between literary history, but between literary and journalism. I think that the book, in a way, is drawing from, but also subverting what Rodolfo Walsh does with Operación Masacre, which was, much like in this book, the story of an extrajudiciary execution at the hands of the police of some men. Walsh's book is from the 50s, and the historical event that Walsh is referencing to happened only 1 year before the book was actually was published in the end. And Piglia started, I think, Plata Quemada, this book project, in trying to do something similar, but it took him 30 years to finish it. And I think that there you get some more, let's say, subjective ingredients, or distorted, more than subjective perhaps, ingredients like memory, or like just the need to think about this historical event in terms of fiction. So he creates these characters, El Gaucho Dorda and El Nene, two homosexual lovers who have all these dialogues that, of course, are just fiction, right? And they're reconstructing this heist. So the novel partakes in the heist thriller, partakes in genre fiction, but at the same time it goes beyond it, much like lots of Argentine literature do with genre fiction. And I don't think it's actually something specific of Argentine literature. You can see this in many Latin American national literatures as well. And I think that you can see that in the dialogues, right? Because in the dialogues you can see how everything is imagined by Piglia. Although he says in the afterword that he wrote this book as if it happened, he means as if it happened according to what he thinks that the people involved might have thought it happened, right? And I think that the key of that myth at play is money, right? It's money, the main topic of the novel. The way money is treated, especially when I mean that the end is the place to start the novel. The end is very long, right? The end of the novel, that final scene in which they're besieged at the Liberaj, at this building in Montevideo. It's a very long scene, and lots of things happen in there. Lots of conversations are held, and lots of reflections about money. And that's, I think, a way that Piglia has to distance himself from journalism and the historical event itself, and do more literature.
So there's a lot there. This is great. So you started there by talking about Rodolfo Walsh, Argentine journalist, and particularly his book Operación Masacre, Operation Massacre, from the 50s, which investigates this state violence. And when Walsh's book first comes out, there are lots of re-editions actually over the decades, aren't there? But when it first comes out, it's still a sort of live issue in some ways, right? And but he's or at least he's trying to show that it's a live issue. It's something that should not be forgotten. That this is a sort of open sore which needs to be investigated. As you say, Piglia is fascinated by this case, this heist, this robbery, and the subsequent siege when it originally happens. Doesn't write about it for until 30 years later. But in some ways, I think he's trying to suggest it's still relevant in some ways. Even if it's even in the 90s, even if most people have forgotten what happened, it was a scandal at the time, it was on TV, it's a very public case. He's suggesting that there's something in the 90s, 30 years later, that still resonates. And yes, maybe it has to do with the power of money, as you're suggesting. Perhaps you could say more about that context of the 90s and why the 60s would still seem to be relevant.
Of course, yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. The crime happened in the 60s, and as you said, it was so big that even though the criminals have escaped to Uruguay, the Argentine police went to Uruguay, which is something very atypical. They didn't let the Uruguayan police deal with the case, but they went to Uruguay and were there at the moment in which they killed the criminals at the end of the story. So, but as you're saying, at the same time, in the 90s, not only people may have forgotten, but lots of people weren't alive in the 60s, right? That were alive in the 90s. So the relationship, the reflections that the book makes about money, I think they're still relevant for two reasons. One of them, I think, is the relationship we could establish between burnt money and the constant metaphors that we have for money around water, right? For instance, we think about water and money when we talk about laundered money, which typically we think negatively about laundered money because it's money that has been taken out of the legal circulation of money. But at the same time, one thing that we can think of is that burnt money is, let's say, more useless than laundered money, right? David Harvey, when he talks about Marx and Marx's understanding of capitalism, talks about how Marx was obsessed about all these metaphors of money and water, right? Money as something liquid, money as something fluid, money as something that is constantly circulating, much like water. And with the idea of burnt money, with the idea of fire quenching or extinguishing this liquid materiality of money, we get two things, I think. We get money turned into the paper, turned into ashes. So people see that money is but paper, is something that can be reduced to ashes. So we kind of have underlined the materiality of money. But at the same time, because the criminals are only killed after they burnt the money, we get the sense of how the symbolic value of money is also emphasized. The power that money has in that people, for instance, who are outside of the building are cheering for the execution to happen. And they are only cheering because they have burned the money, not because they have stolen the money, but because they have burned the money, right? So this very radical scene, I think it speaks to not only the 60s when the novel is set, but also the 90s, los años 90, because it was a very topical theme back then. In the 90s, Argentina was experiencing a monetarist policy. It has, with the government of Carlos Saúl Menem, it was experiencing, in a way, some historians say, whatever the dictatorship, the last dictatorship didn't manage to accomplish in terms of monetarist policies, el gobierno de Menem, the government of Carlos Saúl Menem, managed to take further. So it was a time when money was almost like a god, right? At that time, the Argentine peso was pegged to the American dollar, and there was in the early 90s a period of relative stability, a relative growth in the Argentine economy. So at this precise time, Piglia writes about burnt money, right? So I think that's also needs to be taken into consideration, not just the scene of the 60s, but also what it means in the 90s.
I'm interested. So I always love there's a quotation from someone, I think it's Dillinger, one of these American gangsters of the 1930s. And someone, I think a journalist, is supposed to have asked him, so why do you rob banks, Mr. Dillinger? And he says, well, that's where the money is. Of course, it makes sense. It makes complete sense because money, has this power, as you say. And even in this book, early on, we have the perspective of the bank clerk who is helping to transport the money, and the book tells us that he's often thought about stealing some of this. This is a payroll money that's being taken to the bank for the town hall. It makes sense to try and get money, and if you have to do it illegally, and that's one of the reasons why we like these kinds of heist movies like Ocean's 11 and Ocean's 12 or something, because they indulge a fantasy which is everyone's fantasy, perhaps, right? How to make money quick.
Yeah.
Of course, here what happens is the thieves indulges in their fantasy, and then they take the fantasy away from us by burning the money, by showing that all it is pieces of paper. It can be burnt. It can be burnt as easily. It can be taken away as easily as it can be taken in some ways. This makes me also think this was written in the 90s, but a few years later comes the crisis that follows that monetarist period, the so-called Corralito. Do you want to say anything about that?
Well, it was a crisis about money, right? It was a crisis that, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it basically meant that this convertibility law, the fact that the Argentine peso, which was always, let's say, victim of inflation, there was always inflation in Argentina, and after that period, again, it came back. But the 90s were kind of a parenthesis in that, because the peso and the American dollar were pegged, there was no inflation, but that ended in 2001 with the Corralito crisis, in which faith that there was in Argentine peso was lost. And then there was a political crisis associated, because for that to be maintained, the Argentine government had to incur in a lot of debt with the IMF. So at some point, the system collapsed. And what happened in December of 2001 was that the government, in order to stop a bank run, because people were taking the money outside of Argentina and bringing it overseas to other banks, or just simply taking it away from the Argentine banks, the government stopped that with a famous law that was called Corralito. And basically, it implies that, much like little chickens can't leave, I'm not even sure if there is a word for that. What would be the word for Corralito in English?
Well, we have corral, which is where you keep horses,
Corral,
right?
yeah, like a small place where the chickens in the farm can't leave. So in that same way, the money in the banks couldn't leave the banks, and it was a huge crisis. It ended up causing the middle class, which up to then was pretty dormant in terms of political activism, in terms of complaining about social injustice. It was suddenly affected by the situation in that people couldn't withdraw the money from the banks, and they started protesting in the streets, and that caused a famous crisis in which five presidents occupied the role of president in 1 week. So it was a political economic crisis, and I think that in that sense, Money to Burn, Plata Quemada is a very prophesizing novel, right? And there's something very interesting that the epigraph with which the novel starts, which is an idea that Piglia comes back to a lot, comes from Bertolt Brecht, and is this question of what is more ethical, robbing the money or opening a bank, right? Having a bank to store the money or robbing the money, because exactly it's what you were referring to before, right? This the whole idea of a bank that then takes your money and does other stuff with it is as unethical as robbing a bank.
It also reminds me that both banks and money depend upon trust or belief, right? I mean, that's what a
Faith.
bank run comes when people no longer believe that a bank is a safe place to store their money, and you see the susceptibility, right? The weakness or the precariousness of these institutions, banks, that present themselves as, in terms of security and safety. And in the Argentine crisis in 2001, but in other similar economic crises, you see how vulnerable they are when suddenly there's a lack of collective belief in the entire financial system.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems to me we don't have too much more time, but it seems to me worth thinking about. On the one hand, we've been saying that there's a quite particular Argentine history here, which helps to understand the novel, a particular Argentine relationship to money, which explains some of that context in the 1990s. But you mentioned very early on, when you were talking about the relationship between history and literature, you also used the term myth. And there's various points in this book where Piglia talks about the events as equivalent to a Greek tragedy, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He picks up on these terms like hubris, for instance, and mythos, as if what's happening here has a significant has a much broader, almost philosophical experience. On the one hand, this is a relatively small event, relatively easily forgotten in Argentina, but I think he's trying to tell us something much broader and more far-reaching, in which about the nature of freedom, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think that the myth part has many layers in the novel. The fact that one of the characters is named Gaucho, I think it's an allusion to the fact that we have a story. It's a crime fiction story, as you're saying, but it's not told from the perspective of the hero. It's not told from the perspective of the detective, right? It's told from the perspective of two criminals. And much like the Gaucho Martin Fierro, no? The Gaucho, the figure of the Gaucho was a criminal working in the edges of the law. These two criminals have this anti-heroic, I guess, component to them, and again, money as a myth as well, right? Money as this myth that we put faith into, and I think yes, I think the story is a very national story, but at the same time, it's very transnational, because if we think about money now, we don't carry cash in many developed countries, right? But we still have money. We still have this faith in money that, as you say, is very precarious, because in with the subprime mortgages crisis, lots of people also had money in that, and then they were suddenly lost. Not that different from what happened in Argentina, right? So, of course, the story goes beyond the Argentine case. Yes.
And I guess the question of freedom is interesting to me because, to some extent, isn't the book okay? I'm spitballing, as it were, here, but isn't the book also about? It's not just about money; it's about our relationship with money.
Yeah.
And so the thieves realize, perhaps, that they can become free only by breaking that relationship.
Yeah, there's a very
And
interesting dialogue at the end between the two criminals and one of the comisarios, one of the commissioners, one of the policemen who's outside, who is kind of the metonymy, the representative of the state. He comes from Buenos Aires up to Montevideo. And they have a very interesting dialogue in that all this speech of money and freedom that the two criminals express, they say, you're here, you're very cold in the night at night for a miserable salary, and we're here inside enjoying some champagne and some pizza with all the money that we stole, right? But of course, at the same time, all this individualistic freedom, in a way, is punished at the end of the story because they're killed, right? They become these myths, these mythical figures, these two criminals. But at the same time, there's something that in this execution, they don't get a happy ending. They don't run away with the money, let's say. But at the same time, the money also doesn't go back to where it was. So this very ambivalent, twofold nature of what happens there.
so, yes, they're certainly punished for their, not just for their thievery, right, for their crime, extrajudicially, right? They don't come to court. In that sense, it's a, but they come to a sticky end. Um, in that sense, it's a tragedy, and it's the something the state would rather put behind it, right? Or maybe not just the state, society would rather put behind it. But it works away in Piglia's mind. He can't quite forget it, that there's something there that can be rescued. There's something there that still bothers him, perhaps, that he still wants to write about 30 years later.
Well, yeah, and the fact that in using genre fiction, using detective stories, crime fiction, that traditionally have been about the restoration of, in this case, money going back to the banks, that would mean, right? Restoration of bourgeois values. This is something that, yeah, a critic, Ernst Mandel, says in the 80s when he analyzes classic crime fiction. He says that that's what detective stories are about. The criminals are caught, the justice is restored, we're all safe, everything's fine. Whereas here, criminals are caught, but they're only caught because the crime they have committed, they have perpetrated, is not punishable anymore in a way because there is not possibility no possibility for restoration of justice, right? There's no restoration of the social order. The money is gone. I think that's a very powerful ending.
That seems a good way for us to end this fantastic and very productive and interesting conversation. Thank you so much for your time, Fabricio.
Thank you for having me.